One of the smaller people that I shouted out in my 100k video, actually Tina, clued me into a discourse that was flying completely under my radar. Apparently, back during the 7th console generation, that's the Wii, PS3, and 360, remember, the term JRPG, short for Japanese role-playing game, was a dirty word. Was it? I couldn't remember this being a thing, at least initially. I had to think pretty hard about it, dig up some old articles. I asked Dave about it, who remembered that it was, and then it started to come back to me. Yeah, it was. The Japanese RPG was the darling of the Super Nintendo, and later the PlayStation 1 and 2, specifically Square Enix games like the Final Fantasy series and Chrono Trigger. Hell, Chrono Trigger is widely considered to be the greatest JRPG of all time. And you know, I agree with them. The story, the characters, the graphics and music for the time, all top notch, and the combat is about as tightly refined as turn-based stuff would ever get. Even my Zoomer girlfriend, who cannot stand playing 2D games, really enjoyed Chrono Trigger when I forced her to sit down and play through it. Yes, I did that. Yes, I'm an old man. No, I'm not going to bow to Zoomer casual gaming sensibilities. But once gaming moved into the late 2000s, a whole bunch of things changed. The earliest YouTubers and streamers became popular, with Let's Players and reviewers outside of the grip of game companies giving honest, unfiltered feedback on games. The market shifted too. The Wii brought in a ton of casual gamers who were only interested in waggling around a Wii remote, while the PS3 and 360 were locked in a battle of hardware dominance that was seeing diminishing returns each generation. The popular games of the era were overwhelmingly brown and bloom first-person shooters like Call of Duty, and when big-name Western RPG franchises like The Elder Scrolls and Fallout saw their return to prominence through Bethesda, they were also brown and bloom first-person games. If you went back in time and told a Fallout fan of the 90s that this was the future's Fallout 3, they would have never believed you. And yet, Fallout 3 is a pretty good game. Meanwhile, Japanese RPGs weren't looking so hot. The big title of the era, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, was hot garbage. The other games that came out at the time, like Enchanted Arms, Tales of Vesperia, Eternal Sonata, Blue Dragon, they were all kinda mid. Sorry, but it's true. I'm not faulting you for liking those games if you do. Tales of Vesperia has a soft spot in my heart for sure, being one of the only games that a younger broker dev could afford at the time. But this was not the golden era of the genre. Like I described in my Forspoken video, Square Enix was once a company that could decide the fate of a platform. People bought Super Nintendos for Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. People bought PlayStation 1s for Final Fantasy VII. Fast forward to Final Fantasy XV, sure that's an alright game, but was it single-handedly carrying the PS4? No. PS4s were still flying off store shelves, but that was due to games like Spider-Man, Red Dead Redemption 2, Witcher 3, The Last of Us 2, Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, it's not like Japanese games as a whole had collapsed. Bloodborne is one of the PS4's most beloved titles, but it's clear that for nearly 20 years now, Square Enix has been coasting by on nostalgia and goodwill. Your average unplugged millennial normie who can only spare a couple of hours a week to play video games nowadays still has fond memories of Final Fantasy VII, and I'm sure he enjoyed the Final Fantasy VII Remake as he slowly grazed his way through it over 6 months or so. But it's not a very good game, and new audiences don't have Final Fantasy nostalgia to fall back on. Same with Final Fantasy XV, frankly. In fact, Forspoken was Square Enix's final Hail Mary of the old way of doing things, and it turns out that game has done so poorly that it's tanked the Luminous Productions development studio, and the Square Enix president is getting replaced. What an absolute clusterfuck. But yeah, even though I'm a huge JRPG fan, there was that forgotten period of time in the late 2000s and early 2010s where JRPG was kind of a dirty word, where JRPG fans were hated on a little bit, where the trend of video games had shifted in a different direction. And the director of the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI, Naoki Yoshida, otherwise known as Yoshi-P, sparked a firestorm by stating in a recent interview that in Japan, JRPG is now viewed as a discriminatory term, that people like him were made fun of for creating JRPGs back in the day, and so Japanese developers don't like using it. He is even reluctant to call Final Fantasy XVI a JRPG, even though Final Fantasy is the granddaddy of the genre, for this precise reason. Local Twitter idiot AP Zone Runner's now deleted tweet, taking out of context a snippet of that interview, went viral. FF16 looks dope as fuck, but this interview quote feels like such a colossal misreading of what FF15 actually is, and FF7 Remake actually, and sort of the point of its juxtaposition. I'm quite shocked to see it deployed in the hype cycle for the next game. The snippet reads, "In talking about Final Fantasy XVI's darker tone, Yoshida said, the past 10 or so years of Final Fantasy has been about how bright the series is. You still have these dark themes about how we're going to save the world, but then it's like you have these kids that are in their teens, running around saving the world, having fun and going fishing and things like that, even though the world is supposed to be ending. And so there's not a sense of reality." And fair enough, Final Fantasy XV had a pretty apocalyptic element to it, but there was also so much lounging around to do in the game. Chocobo races, fishing spots, going camping. I remember social media of the time loving it for how goofy Noctis was in his off time in comparison to the main plot. But Final Fantasy XVI seems to be stripping the futuristic elements out of the game again and going back to its medieval roots, complete with a Game of Thrones style plot, full of corrupt nobles and wars between houses. It really sounds like we're going back to the days of Final Fantasy Tactics, with different feudal lords fighting over who gets to sit on the Imperial throne or something. This became known as the Blitzball discourse. Blitzball is probably the most egregious Final Fantasy minigame of all time. In Final Fantasy X, there are these floating globes of water that teams who can hold their breath for hours at a time, I guess, play 3D underwater soccer in. It's ridiculous, it's goofy, it's not really all that fun to play, and it's the main thing people think about when they hear the name Final Fantasy X 20 years later. Also, the voice acting. It's called the Blitzball discourse because Blitzball is emblematic of the Final Fantasy series' constant shoehorning in of weird side games that don't really mesh well with the main game, in any way, in terms of story, or how fun they are to play, or how alike they are to the rest of the game, sometimes even in terms of their art style. But nonetheless, to the fans, these are considered beloved quirks of the genre. The bit of the Yoshida interview that went viral seems to be Yoshida disparaging older Final Fantasy games for lacking focus, and that Final Fantasy XVI would not be this way. But that whole topic was actually addressed in the very same interview. The Twitter idiot just didn't post the context. Yoshida did say that while the game was going to be darker than the last few titles, and that there would definitely be no Blitzball, there would still be fun side content. You could go to a base that you can build up, you can go on hunts to take down legendary monsters. It wasn't just going to be a series of hallways connecting set pieces and cutscenes like a lot of Western games have been in the past decade. So, a quick recap of the drama. Yoshida said in a recent interview he doesn't want to call Final Fantasy XVI a JRPG because JRPG is considered a disparaging term among Japanese game developers. This stems from the poor Western reception of Japanese games from 10 to 15 years ago, as opposed to the height of the genre during the Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1 days. And so, game journalists and developers, being a bunch of progressive Twitter addicts, decided to take this as Yoshida saying that he hates JRPGs and that he is being a self-hating racist. Meanwhile, these same progs were the source of the racism from back then. Y'all remember this shit? Remember Alex Hutchinson saying that Japanese games were all gibberish, and that the only reason Japanese games like Bayonetta score as high as they do is because of a subtle racism in the business, especially on the journalist side, where Japanese developers are forgiven for doing what they do? This is a progressive in 2012 appealing to the soft bigotry of low expectations. This is now considered a right-wing talking point in today's political climate. Alex would be crucified as an alt-writer today. Remember former indie darling and Fez creator Phil Fish saying that in 2012, Japanese games just suck, and then mocked the possibility that any of this could come from a place of racism? Seriously, if you go back and look at these people, they're doing everything that they now shit on others for today. Here's the GDQ clip when it happened.
I'm a freelance game programmer, and in this movie, you were inspired from Super Mario and Metroid and Rockman. I am so proud of it, and as a Japanese. And my question is, could you tell me what kind of about recently Japanese? What do you think about the recently Japanese game?
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Most recent Japanese
I'm sorry.
games.
They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed.
That guy that Phil Fish just shat on, by the way, that's not just some random Japanese guy, as the West reported on back in the day. Really playing up that all Asians look alike racism here, guys. That's Makoto Goto. He worked on Final Fantasy, Front Mission, Armored Core, and most recently, AI, the Somnium Files. Meanwhile, what's Phil Fish doing? Oh, fucking nothing. He made Fez in 2012, and that's it. Hey, you wanna know some deep SFO lore? A lot of the articles floating around the internet today claim that Phil Fish left the gaming industry due to the harassment he received during GamerGate. That's technically true, but it wasn't harassment, it was an expose by our channel. Back in 2014, a bunch of the financial documents of Phil Fish's company, Polytron, hit 4chan. He blamed angry GamerGaters hacking his company, but analysis of the files showed that they came from a flash drive, which makes it much more likely that a disgruntled Polytron employee dumped them onto the internet as revenge for Phil Fish's shitty behavior. We got a hold of the files, and after doing some cross-referencing, noticed that the list of Polytron's investors, a private list by the way, were the same people who were judges at the Independent Games Festival. These people were set to make money with the success of Fez and the increased valuation of Polytron as a company. This also explains why, despite the IGF stated rules that games can only win awards on the year they come out, Fez won awards during both 2008's IGF and 2012's IGF, with the IGF claiming that the 2008 version was a different game because it was a demo. Fez is, to my knowledge, the only game to have been privileged in this way by the IGF, and is also the only one where people in the IGF stood to make personal profit off the success of a game that they were supposed to be impartially judging. My video back in 2014 spooked the indie game scene so much that the IGF actually rushed out a short blurb that basically said, "We have investigated ourselves and found nothing wrong." You can even go back and see it on their website, it's still there. There's an old Forbes article that implies that I privated my videos because the information in them was false. That's not true at all. I stand by the information in my GamerGate videos 9 years later. I privated them because Phil Fish sent me a cease and desist, and I was a recent university graduate and I was poor as fuck. If there's one thing that I do regret, it's that. I should have made him sue me. I put the videos back up a few months later, and they remain up to this day. Now that I'm not a channel with only a couple thousand subs anymore, now that I've made a few more connections with people over the years, I've heard through the grapevine that one big reason Phil Fish doesn't make indie games anymore is because my video exposed him and his friends to be fucking snakes, and outside of the progressive clique, people don't really want to work with him anymore. So yeah, Phil Fish did get harassed out of the game industry by GamerGate, but to use modern terminology, he got cancelled by me. Meanwhile, Makoto Goto's career is alive and well. It might take a long time. It might take over a decade, guys, but truth does tend to win out in the long run. Alright, deep SFO lore time over. The point is, Phil Fish and everyone else like him treated Japanese games and Japanese people like shit, and they now try to paint themselves as progressive darlings. You know who else has done that? Adam Sessler, otherwise known as Big Clap Man from the twice-failed channel G4. Let's see what he had to say about JRPGs back in 2004.
And we all know who will replace us. India, that billion-strong faux vegetarian tech support call-taking behemoth of a nation. Or the Chinese. But certainly not Japan, because while they may be technologically advanced and financially powerful, they're already in decline. You want proof? Here's Baten Kaito's origins.
All right, the story. Let me guess. There's probably a young hero with some sort of memory problem who's fighting a vastly overwhelming Evo fascio magical empire. Cliche burden boy of action who will save us all is named Sagi. Rhymes with Saki. Saki! Which I could use a lot of right now.
Sagi.
Saki! And apparently nothing says prequel like improved breast physics on the shopkeepers.
Sagi.
Sake!
Sagi.
Saki! Will you shut up about Sagi?
Sagi.
Saki! 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 Baten Kaido's origin is an RPG for the GameCube. That about says it all.
Okay, I did not expect Morgan Webb to be promoting the Great Replacement theory in today's video. That was a bit out of left field. But yeah, these people pin themselves as anti-racist progressives nowadays. This clip is full of racism, but it is clearly meant as a juvenile joke. If Sessler were a serious racist, like an actual alt-righter or something, he probably wouldn't be complaining about the fascist empire that features in the game he's reviewing. He was just being edgy, and I can appreciate that. That is the brand of stupid internet humor that I like. Just acting retarded for a laugh. I would have laughed a lot at this back in the day. Hell, I laughed a little bit at it now. But the point is, Adam Sessler, the people at G4 who made this, are now morally grandstanding at you because you're not on the bleeding edge of the next progressive culture war. And this wasn't the only time G4 did stuff like this. I'm an old G4 viewer, and I remember it happening pretty regularly. A lot of it's been unfortunately lost to time, but I did manage to scrounge up one more clip from the old days.
We have with us now the communications director of the Digital Devil Saga campaign, Kyoko Toriyama, with a reaction to the criticisms that their game was just too difficult to understand.
モーガンさん、ありがとうございます。ノミネートされてとても光栄です。大勢のアメリカ人プレイヤーがデジタルデビルセガについて混乱していると思うので、このビデオのストーリーを説明するビデオを準備しました。どうぞ楽しんでください。
桃鉄で遊ぼう。作れない。レボリューション。PS2 に。
supposed to mean?
実はその質問よくされます。ビデオを説明する短いプレゼンテーションも一緒に準備しました。どうぞ楽しんでください。ありがとうございました。モーガンさん、アダムさん。
I fear for the day that zany, bean curd loving race finally rules over us.
Now see, I found that funny, but I wonder if Morgan Webb or Adam Sessler would still refer to the Japanese as a race of zany, bean curd loving inevitable rulers of the West in 2023. Probably not. And by the way, they'll call you a bigot for enjoying comedy that was just normal back then, comedy that they produced for you to laugh at. It's okay if they want to do racist Japanese accents, but you are a fascist if you don't want a drag queen twerking in front of a child. The late 2000s internet was stuffed full of people hating on everything Japanese, up to and including racism, who now present themselves as the bastions of proper leftist politics. A lot of this stuff has been lost to time, either because the people involved have scrubbed it out of embarrassment, or websites have died, or articles have been deleted or whatever, but there's enough of it still floating around that it's not hard to get a glimpse of what it was like. These people's shitty behavior was so poorly received in Japan that, like Yoshida said, Japanese developers began to view their own styles, their own genres, as bad. One of the reasons why a lot of Japanese developers have abandoned what once made them good in favor of more Western-focused games is because of this backlash. I'm not surprised that the word JRPG holds this negative connotation over there. And to see the people who caused that now come out and say that hating JRPGs is racist? Fuck off. If these people were actually intelligent and actually capable of critiquing video games and actually wanted to analyze what was going on here beyond just being racist pricks, here's what they would say. In terms of video games, the most influential game of all time is Pong. The second most influential one is not a video game at all, it's Dungeons & Dragons. Released in 1974, Dungeons & Dragons was an attempt to marry war miniatures with a Tolkien-like fantasy adventure. A lot of the nerds of the 70s who played D&D were also the same nerds who were messing around with the earliest Play-Doh computers. And so it's no surprise to me that there were early attempts to try and make a computer play the role of a dungeon master. These early games were blatant D&D ripoffs, with random number generators taking the place of dice, with stats and combat and leveling out all playing out like D&D handled by a computer. The most notable of these was the appropriately named Moria from 1975, where 10 players on a local network all took turns walking through a procedurally generated mine, killing monsters and getting loot. The idea of a computer generating random dungeons was so interesting that it led to the 1980 seminal title Rogue, from which we get today's roguelike. Core components of Rogue are that the dungeon is different every time, and that character death is permanent, forcing you to restart the game, two qualities that you can still see traces of in modern roguelikes today. When the Apple II computer became a relatively common middle-class household furnishing in 1977, a new generation of developers began to see if they could recreate those early D&D ripoffs on the new hardware. This led to two very important but very different games, both released in 1981, Wizardry and Ultima. In Wizardry, you start the game by building a party, buying your gear, and then you're dropped into a D&D-style dungeon on a grid with random enemies and treasure and traps. Combat is turn-based, according to a bare-bones version of D&D rules, and you spend your time in this claustrophobic catacomb exploring and leveling up. Ultima, meanwhile, featured a top-down exploration system, akin to a D&D-style world map, where you could walk around and find new locations, towns to visit with NPCs to talk to. I know this is all really common stuff nowadays, but Ultima was the first game to do it. The dungeons were still first-person and grid-like though, like Wizardry's, due to their shared D&D origins. Both of these games would inspire The Bard's Tale in 1985, which took aspects of both. The developers of that game, Interplay, believed that this format would work not only for medieval games, but futuristic ones too, and adapted it to a post-apocalyptic setting for 1988's Wasteland. The top-down perspective of Ultima was adapted to be an isometric perspective, due to increasing graphical capability in the 90s. Later Ultima games were the first isometric ones, and titles like Diablo and Baldur's Gate really made the format shine. The developers of Wasteland made the jump too, releasing the first Fallout game in this style. In 1992, Ultima Underworld adapted the grid-like D&D dungeon to a more modern-looking first-person perspective that controlled almost like an FPS. It was this innovation that inspired the first Elder Scrolls game in 1994. At the same time, Japan was getting its own line of computers. Japanese gamers were playing imported copies of Wizardry and Ultima, and they were getting inspired. The earliest Japanese developers began to make games of this type with their own twist, like 1984's Mugen no Shinzo, which is clearly based on Ultima, and Lizard from the same year, which is more like Wizardry. In Japan, the next big thing was Nintendo's Famicom, which would be released as the NES in the West, and Japanese developers wanted to make RPGs for that system as well. But the Famicom was meant to be cheap and affordable, The necessity of getting through that hardware bottleneck led to the developers at Enix streamlining all the qualities of RPGs that Japanese gamers loved into something that the Famicom could run. The result was the first Dragon Quest game in 1986. It used Ultima's exploration and Wizardry's combat system. Both had to be stripped of some complexity in order to run in the Famicom, but the end result wasn't a loss of quality. Instead of creating a lesser product, they ended up cutting a lot of the fat. What remained was a more tightly focused experience, which is why Dragon Quest is considered the beginning of a new genre, the JRPG. Japanese-made RPGs before this point were copies of Western RPGs. With Dragon Quest, they had become their own thing. Overcoming the hardware limitations of the Famicom led to less procedural generation, more pre-programmed characters and encounters, less character customization, but more tightly focused mechanics for your characters, less surprise, but more story to make up for it. After Dragon Quest's success, we got Final Fantasy, we got Phantasy Star. In the next generation, we got Chrono Trigger and Earthbound, and just an explosion of this genre. Even though the hardware bottleneck of the Famicom was gone, the convention remained. A JRPG differed from a WRPG in that though they both used items and turn-based combat and magic spells and level-ups, JRPGs featured a more tightly crafted story experience, while WRPGs allowed for more greater exploration and player choice. This is because WRPGs remained on home computers, while JRPGs had to be adapted to consoles, and the limitations of each platform influenced the direction of game development. What I'm getting at with all of this is, we can trace back to Dungeons & Dragons not only the modern Western RPG, but the roguelike, top-down isometric RPGs and adventure games, text-based games, first-person RPGs like modern Fallouts and Elder Scrolls and Mass Effect. Hell, pretty much every single game has adapted an RPG-style stats system. Call of Duty has stats on its guns now, and that's the only kind of Call of Duty that kids today know. That would have been considered blasphemous back when I was in school. Numbers were for fucking losers. Large swaths of modern gaming has taken something from Dungeons & Dragons if you go back far enough, and the Japanese have contributed many innovations to all of these genres. You can not like those genres and innovations, that's fine, but to claim that they're bad because they're Japanese is actually, yeah, pretty racist. But if these people truly understood gaming, they'd know where the JRPG came from, the conventions of the genre, its pitfalls, yes, but the reasons for them, and how Japanese developers do actually understand those pitfalls and contribute their own innovations to game design. I actually really love this type of cross-cultural contamination, where one culture picks up an innovation from another and puts a spin on it and creates something new. Games like Earthbound and Deadly Premonition really rank up there for me, not because they're good, they've got serious flaws, but their whole thing is a Japanese attempt to write something that is authentically American. They can't because they're not authentically American themselves, but the filtering of Americana through a Japanese lens and then translated back into English for a Western release created some very unique experiences that you can't really get anywhere else. And the progressive indie developers who were inspired by these games to make their own quirky JRPG end up creating only pale imitations, because while they're attempting to create an American game filtered through a Japanese lens looking at America, they can't do it because they hate Japan. This really just does stem from racism on the part of the progs. Look at this delusional article, talking about how it's Western developers who truly understand what the JRPG is, how Japan is stagnant, and how progress in game design aligns with having leftist politics. This article dropped within a year of Tales of Berseria, Dragon Quest XI, Persona 5, Neo, Octopath Traveler, and Nier Automata, all of which contributed to a huge wave of quality Japanese games. While the article holds up Western indie garbage like HYUK as progress in JRPGs, and the entire thing is about millennial hipsters reliving their glory days. HYUK is going to have to be its own video one day, because that rabbit hole is way too deep. But just to give you a taste, a good chunk of the game has the characters break the fourth wall to talk about the developers' other games, in a way that makes clear that the developers really wanted those games to be their big breakaway hit, not HYUK. And this is what's really at the core of this conversation. Frankly, it's what's at the core of a lot of the gaming-centric videos I do on this channel. If you're in your 30s like I am, hell, for some of you even in your 20s, back when you were young, you were probably picked on for enjoying video games. You were the nerdy kid that the popular boys beat up and the girls laughed at. If you were a gamer girl, the popular girls probably beat you up and the boys probably thought you were a poser. For all of us, graduation was basically a relief. We could all move away and put these people safely in the rearview mirror. But that's not how it turned out. All of these game journos, these progressive indie developers, they're all cut from the same cloth as the old bullies. Now that gaming's popular, and not just for nerds, they want a piece of the pie. They want to say that they were always the real fans, the legitimate voice of what is in gaming. And now that progressive politics are also popular, they want to forget everything in their past that they actually did. From edgy humor, to racism, to bullying Japanese developers for being too Japanese, to bullying fans for liking Japanese games, or games at all. Look at Elden Ring. It's made by a Japanese company, and it's an RPG. Would we call it a JRPG? Well, probably not. JRPGs as a genre came about due to adapting D&D conventions to hardware limitations, creating new conventions as a result. Elden Ring has more in common with other open-world Western RPGs, where you can build your character how you like, customize your leveling experience, explore the world in any direction. The combat is all Souls-like, of course, it's not turn-based. But no RPGs are turn-based anymore. Mass Effect is a third-person shooter, Fallout is a first-person shooter. Top-down isometric games are all real-time now. The only games that are still turn-based are either grand strategy games or developers appealing to old hardware limitations again, like how Sea of Stars is cut from the cloth of Chrono Trigger, or how Octopath Traveler feels like Final Fantasy VI made 3D. But even though Elden Ring is not a JRPG, it still received a lot of unwarranted backlash from game journals when it came out. They were crying about how it's a bigoted game because it's not inclusive enough because it's hard. Souls-like combat is notoriously hard, that's the whole point. But look at the circle that we've come around. These people back in the day were shitting on Japanese game developers in a pretty racist way because they were still making turn-based RPGs and doing anime-style storylines in an era where Western developers were moving all of their RPGs into the realm of shooters and action games and going for more grimdark bullshit. That poor reaction, as well as lowering sales over time, of Japanese games led to Japanese developers to feel a stigma around their own creations, to the point that Japanese developers have largely abandoned large swaths of what made them unique and interesting. Old beloved IPs like Mega Man and Castlevania are dead, and they seem to be never coming back. The companies that own those IPs are now focusing almost exclusively on products that look like they're made by Western developers. Games that used to be JRPGs, like Final Fantasy, are now action-based shadows of their former selves, because as Yoshida put it, Japanese developers feel they are discriminated against based on the kinds of games that they make. And the racist progressive fucks who caused all of this are now, years later, screaming that games are too hard and Japanese developers are not inclusive enough, when it was their mockery that caused the abandonment of a genre that was uniquely Japanese, and was frankly pretty easy to play. For turn-based games, all you gotta do is navigate through a fucking menu. Game journalists and progressive indie developers are scumfucks. They are some of the worst, most hypocritical people you can bump into. These people dare to claim some sort of a moral high ground when their racism, the very thing that they cancel people over today, caused the problem that they're complaining about right now. Fuck these people. Thanks for watching, guys. This one took more work than I thought, so I appreciate you sticking it out to the end. While you're here, you might as well click on the link on screen, because on the side channel, Naomi and I watched the movie Cocaine Bear and gave our thoughts about it. So if you want to see more Dev, that's where you can go and see it. Thank you very much, guys. I love you.